Well, let's start. Good afternoon. I'm Chappell Lawson. I'm an associate professor in the political science department and also a faculty affiliate at the Center for International Studies. Welcome to today's MIT Starr Forum, Beyond 9/11, Homeland Security for the 21st Century. This event follows the publication of an edited volume of the same name. You can see the title behind me, to which all of today's speakers contributed. It is also the center's way of commemorating the terrorist attacks of 9/11 that killed nearly 3,000 Americans on this day, 19 years ago. And as academics, to reflect upon the progress that has been made or not made since then. I hate that we cannot all be in the same room, and I hate that we cannot have the kind of aerobic in-person exchanges for which the Center and the Security Studies program are justly famous. On the other hand, the silver lining is that it would have been logistically impossible to get this group of speakers together in the same venue at the same time, especially so soon before a presidential election. So I'd like to thank all of them in advance, and especially Juliette Kayyem of the Harvard Kennedy School, who has graciously agreed to act as our moderator. She will be directing questions of her own confection first to the panel, and then directing questions from all of you. So if you haven't already, you can find the Q&A feature at the bottom of your toolbar, and that is where you can type in your questions. I also hope you'll find the chat function at the bottom of the toolbar as well, where we'll be sending out links to bios of the speakers, upcoming events, links to curated information, and other information might be of interest to you. So with that, Professor Kayyem, over to you.
Here is a big crew, and just grateful for all of your time today. It was a coincidence that we were able to get everyone together, and just the Friday after Labor Day seemed like a good time. Obviously, that coincidence has meaning for all of us, personal and professional. So we are cognizant that this is not just an intellectual exercise, but for so many of us, one that touched us deeply on that day and even 19 years later. But it's also a time to account for what does sort of this all mean. 19 years is a long time. A lot has happened since that 19 years. We are talking to you, talking in quotes, during a crisis that is having a fatality impact every 2 to 3 days, the equivalent of the single day of 9/11. And so a lot has changed, and the department that was built in the name of the post 9/11 structure has changed. All of us here have changed about how we think about Homeland Security. And so with Chap and Alan Bersin, who you'll meet in a minute, we thought it was a good time to account for what those changes meant, how to think about 9/11, a post 9/11 Homeland Security architecture that wasn't just focused on a department. Homeland Security, if you haven't guessed already, given that we're talking this way, touches us in ways that that are intimate, that are about our homes and communities, and the threats that we face as parents and community members as well. So what we tried to do in the book is to look at those themes. So while we talk about terrorism and climate change and border and immigration and pandemics and all the borderless threats that we now face as a nation, we also wanted to look at more thematically what is going on with Homeland Security and how can we think about it holistically. So this is not just about the department. And I think we were incredibly lucky to get an amazing crew, not just the people here whose bios, I'm not going to do the bio thing, you're going to see on the screen with them and others to contribute to a book that I think, arrogantly, I guess, is really the first accounting of what Homeland Security should be as we think past the current moment into the rest of the century. So without further ado, how it's going to work is I'm going to do a quick round with a simple question to give everyone an opportunity to tell us their thoughts, and then direct questions both related to the headlines and some of the dramas of today for the second half hour, and then open it up to you for the last 30 minutes. Once again, I want to thank the team at MIT for putting this together with Chap and Michelle and others, and then the team at the Kennedy School, Tara Tyrell, and I think Yvonne is on, who have just done a wondrous job with an edited volume and getting these events started. So thank you all as well. So Amy Pope, you are on from London.
Fantastic.
Amy served as Deputy Homeland Security Advisor, and we'll get her up on screen. The question I want to ask is pretty simple and open-ended, which is basically, how would you fix Homeland Security?
Well, look, there's an answer to that question that predates Trump, and there's an answer to that question that postdates Trump. If we look at what the department has become post-Trump, it's been entirely focused on immigration, but not on immigration threats. So number one, I would bring the department back to its primary mission of recognizing that most immigrants pose no threat at all. The real question and the challenge is how to figure out those who do. And the way that the department is now going about that mission, from my point of view, is the wrong way to use scarce resources. But if we just even look back a couple years before Trump, I think the number one issue is that it basically still functions as a bunch of different agencies who've been thrown in together. They don't have similar technology. They don't have similar oversight within Congress. They don't always have the same outcomes and objectives. And that's where you've got to start if you want to fix the department.
Thank you, Amy. Chap, I'm going to turn to you, who served in the department, not at the White House, thinking about this question about, which basically animated us for the book, which is, is there a beyond 9/11?
I think it's the right question for all of us to address. So I'm not going to talk about what is necessarily the single most important and pressing short-term issue, but over the long term, I have noticed something that's quite disturbing. And to me, that's an increasing gap between the American people on the one hand and the federal Homeland Security enterprise on the other. As this enterprise has gotten more centralized and more capacious, necessarily so, it's unfortunately also become increasingly detached from the people it was supposed to protect. And anyone who remembers in the pre-COVID era flying into the country or on an airplane domestically or applying for a visa to MIT probably does not find the face of DHS particularly friendly. And if anything, it has become less friendly still. Witness the dispatch of Vortec teams to the streets of Portland against civilian rioters. And I think if we continue on this path, we will at best obtain resigned compliance from a reluctant citizenry that has relatively little trust in the federal government's Homeland Security efforts. And that will show up, whether it's declination to share personal information with the federal government or local resistance to federal immigration reform efforts, or in some other way will handicap and hobble federal Homeland Security efforts. So I would love to blame everything on the current administration, and they certainly deserve their share of the blame. But I think there's a structural problem here that's more fundamental. Because Homeland Security sits at the intersection of law enforcement and national security, and so it inevitably raises these vexed questions of civil liberties and privacy and emergency powers. So what should we do? My recommendation is that we engage in a kind of strategic rethink about how to approach the relationship between the Homeland Security enterprise and American civil society. And that can take many forms, which we can discuss later, but it ranges from everything from making sure that Americans have enough information about day-to-day operations to be able to monitor the street-level bureaucracy in Homeland Security, to finding ways to engage Americans in Homeland Security operations without having vigilance shade into vigilantism. again, I can come back to the specifics, but I would just say in closing that if we do address this problem, we will both improve the Homeland Security enterprise materially, and we will help mold it to American political culture. And if we don't, our problems are going to multiply regardless of who's in charge 1 year hence.
That's fantastic, Chap. And Alan, that leads to you, Alan Bersin, who had a variety of important roles at the department. I mean, Chap talks about this detachment, and in some ways, what was your key docket, which was the homeland to the outside world, really does speak to that as well, as the sort of, you know, necessity of the outside and inside. And so was curious your thoughts to that sort of more open-ended question that I raised.
Yeah, so thanks, Juliette, and hello to everybody. Building on Chap's point about the gap that exists between the public and the Homeland Security enterprise, I want to focus on a fundamental gap in the public's understanding of Homeland Security with regard to its international functions. So most people find it oxymoronic to think that Homeland Security is not exclusively concerned with domestic concerns and domestic safety. But to the contrary, in an age of globalization and with technology drawing us all together, and as we're particularly seeing nowadays with the pandemic, there's nothing that affects the homeland adversely, and I would argue positively, that doesn't have a cause or effect that's generated abroad. So Homeland Security is intrinsically transnational, inherently transnational. And let me just make 3 quick points, and we can pick this up in the later discussion. The first is that today's threats, contemporary threats, don't recognize national boundaries. We talk about the borderless threats of cybersecurity and pandemics, obviously, counterterrorism, which is not within one jurisdiction. Unlike what we saw in the past and what we believed in the past, the ports of entry, the 327 airports, seaports, and land ports that we welcome goods and people into the country are not the last line of defense. They're really not the first line of defense. They're really the last line of defense. We have to actually get out in front of it. We cannot, the second point, we cannot protect the homeland without having the DHS personnel abroad. And it will surprise some people to discover that the Department of Homeland Security and the 8 operating components, the main operating components, actually have the largest third largest civilian footprint abroad after the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department. Third, and this is a point that Chap alluded to in a slightly different context, the distinctions, the old traditional distinctions between Homeland Security and national security, between foreign affairs and domestic affairs, between law enforcement and national security, these sharp divisions really have given way to a continuum that we have to recognize and take into account as we restructure the enterprise. The upshot of all of this is that the current administration's effort to withdraw from the world behind a fiercely nationalistic America First regime, the point is that it not only does damage to our international security posture, but also to our homeland security posture. And that's a point that I think we need to hammer home as we rebuild relationships with the world. So the bottom line is that we cannot do this alone anymore in a global age. We can't go it alone, at least not successfully.
Thank you, Alan. That's terrific, and a great segue to Pete Neffenger, who spent a career in the Coast Guard, but then, I shouldn't say but, would run TSA at the end of the Obama administration about this idea of this. I mean, you dealt with borders every single day with the transportation industry. So you're curious your thoughts now that you've been out a while as well.
Well, thanks, Juliette. You know, that's a big question you ask. And the book does, I think, a good job of tackling some of those component level challenges and policies and the like. But for me, any answer begins at a real fundamental level. And it was implied by Chap, Amy, and Alan in their comments. First, why is there a Department of Homeland Security? what's the DHS mission, and most importantly, who is DHS? And you can find DHS's answer in their mission statement. With honor and integrity, we will safeguard the American people, our homeland, and our values. And there's actually a lot packed into those 15 words: how to act, on whose behalf to act, and why to act. So it's a pledge, and a pledge that defines and sits astride the oath of office that every one of us in public service took. And it asserts both the expected and the required DHS identity for every member of the department. As you noted, I spent 36 years in public-facing, mission-focused agencies tasked with protecting the country. At first, the US Coast Guard, then the TSA. And agencies like these are the retail public face of DHS. And in the case of TSA, it's arguably the retail face of the federal government, with some 2.5 million people each day passing through a TSA checkpoint pre-pandemic. So if we believe in honor and integrity, in safeguarding the public, in protecting the nation's values, then you have to define, exemplify, and emphasize that every single day in that public face. Because no matter what we say, the public face is the real face, and that's our true identity. In our airports, along our borders, in our cities, and anywhere else the department presents itself. The public we serve determines the real identity of DHS based upon what they see and how DHS acts, how we all acted when we were there. And how DHS acts, in turn, shapes the DHS identity and culture. So you have to be very careful how you act, because identity is a reinforcing loop. So I'd fix DHS by binding every component of the department first and foremost to that pledge, by specifically embedding the promise and the intent of the pledge into the department's policies and procedures, into agency operational doctrine and tactics, into use of force policy, into domestic and international deployment considerations and training, into our emergency response operations, into every one of the thousands of operational and tactical decisions that the department collectively makes every single day, and that directly affect the public and the nation that we've sworn to serve. That's really hard work. It takes commitment, courage, and a constant effort, but it can be done because I've seen it done. And leaders and the agencies they lead can be held accountable for living up to those values that we claim to hold dear and important.
I think that's a important point. Most of us have put a footprint, at least at DHS, at some point. We both, at the same time, you know all of its tremendous flaws, but also all of its potential if we could only get it right at any given moment. And I think in that point, the lawyer for us all, Steve is there, the general counsel at DHS from 2013 to 2017, got a flavor or, oversaw every legal aspect and has written a terrific chapter on privacy. And, from your perch, wanted you to answer the question as well, and also as a lawyer in the space as well.
Well, thanks, Juliette. And I really do appreciate Admiral Neffenger's comments. I think it all starts from having the kind of culture that he was describing. And the structures really are only as good as the culture and the people at some level. But let me just suggest one area. I'm not sure it is the critical problem, but with respect to data security and privacy, I really think that is an area where the department needs to get more serious. I think it's the central challenge of the future. Data security and privacy are really not law enforcement challenges. They're risk management challenges. And that is really what DHS specializes in. And I think DHS needs to be given more authorities, more resources, so they can actually tackle those problems. I would try to figure out what happened to my iPad. Just died, so I'm going to have to wing this. I would try to rethink the way we approach the trade-off between security and privacy, so that we are looking for what we could call security privacy win-wins. I think there are ways that, many ways, frankly, that we can leverage two things: technology and trust-building exercise, trust-building measures. And if we do those things in a smart way, we can find ourselves with things that both make us more secure, measures that make us more secure, but also are more protective of privacy. And historically, we've effectively relied on the inefficiency and to a certain extent the incompetency of government data. The fact that the government's not very good at collecting data and using it. But with modern technology, we're actually getting more capable, and agencies like TSA are making really smart use of data to be smarter about the way they advance their screening mission at airports, for instance. And we don't want to give that up, but in order to do that in a way that people trust and feel safe about, we need to be much more intentional about the way we build privacy protections into what we do. So I think a central challenge going forward is to get serious about data security and privacy, and not just focus on what I would call the traditional challenges of the 9/11 era.
Thank you, Stephen. Seth, I'm going to turn to you. Seth, as extensive operational and policy experience in trade and borders and immigration, sort of the other, we think about threats, but there's lots of good things that we want to promote as well. So I'm going to turn to you last, and then we'll start our round of questions.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Juliette, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this. It's really great, and it's quite daunting to go last after hearing the eloquence of all of my great friends and colleagues before me. So I'm going to talk. I'll talk about borders and COVID a bit later, but I think in terms of answering the initial question, I guess I'll just go back to as my late father would say, going around Hogan's barn a little bit on this question. I was actually in New York City on 9/11 itself, and saw much of what happened, including the fires in the World Trade Center and all that. And I was yanked into what ultimately became the Department of Homeland.
Did we lose him? We lost him. Seth, I see, this is why I have to be on my toes. Seth, we'll come back to you. You may want to reboot. Okay, so I'm sure what Seth was going to say was genius, and we'll let him say it next, but this is the nature of the game. So what I want to do for the next half hour, just now that you've heard sort of a conceptual thing, is maybe drill down on specific topics, and then of course with COVID. So one way to think about Homeland Security, so I'll get out of my moderator mode since I was also a contributor, is to think that you're, as Steve was saying, don't think of things as binary, sort of as choices between we're either pro-liberty and, or pro-security. For Homeland Security, you're trying to do three things simultaneously, and we'll get into this related to specific threats. You're trying to minimize all risks. So the interesting thing about the book is it's not a terrorism book, it's not a COVID book, it's not a climate change book, it's all of the above. You're trying to maximize unified defenses. In other words, it's the private sector that Alan was talking about. It's the international community. It's local and state governments. Look at COVID, the hospitals, individuals who, as we have a chapter on emergency management. What are we supposed to prepare for? And then third is you want to maintain, and this is where we'll focus now, on who we are as a homeland. I mean, in other words, even if arguably you could say, for example, just to touch a third rail, child separation would minimize some risks, maximize some defenses. At some stage, a department or a policy has to step back and say, we just don't go there. It's just not who we are. And that's, I think, what the debate is. I'll end with this and then turn back to you, Seth. The hard part of Homeland Security is not the security part. Every person on this panel can tell you how to do the security part. It's the homeland part and who we are. So Seth, let me go back to you. I was filling time.
Thank you. I have no clue what happened. Suddenly it just got thrown off the Zoom. Maybe it's something I said, but anyway, what I was saying was that, so I was in New York on 9/11 and was brought into the administration very quickly. First day was September 24th, 2001. And what became the department. So I'm a double header. I've served in Bush and Obama. And what I remember at that time was the sense of unity that we had coming in and the sense of purpose, sort of real national unity. And when the Department of Homeland Security was ultimately created, it was created in that spirit of unity. And I remember Tom Ridge, who I worked with a fair amount, saying repeatedly, we don't do politics in Homeland Security. It's not our job. We don't do politics. And what I would say is that the biggest problem facing the Department of Homeland Security right now is actually the politicization of the Department of Homeland Security. With the sort of the reverse of what Tom Ridge said at the very beginning as the key plank of DHS. And so you can see it, I think, face it, DHS is an inherently political department. We fight over immigration and trade and all these things, and that's okay. That's necessary. But I think it's different to say that it's politicized in the sense of, you can see it in so many of the things we've seen recently, like the decision on global entry in New York, which basically DHS kicked New York residents out of global entry, the CBP Trusted Traveler program, essentially in retaliation for New York sanctuary state law. Ultimately was challenged, and DHS and CBP had to recant and actually admitted that they had lied to the court in saying, why New York had been kicked out. Also, you can see it in the politicization of intelligence and analysis. Dossiers on journalists that were covering Portland, or the fudging of intelligence analysis and downplaying on the white nationalist terrorist threat or the Russia threat, or in Portland, you're seeing this. And it's extremely dangerous from all kinds of different perspectives. I think it's dangerous from the perspective of authoritarianism, in the sense of, DHS is the largest federal law enforcement agency, and you can see it. The fearsomeness of the BORTAC units and fatigues of M4 rifles and body armor and unmarked cars in Portland. It's dangerous. I think it's also, as again, citing Tom Ridge, DHS was not intended to be a personal presidential militia going into cities. That wasn't the intent of DHS from the beginning. And yet that seems to be what's happened. So I think that's dangerous. It's also dangerous from the perspective of the long-term interests of the department, not only the credibility with people in the country, but also state and local governments. DHS depends on state and local governments to function. And if we've poisoned our relationship with state and local governments through not only the Portland and Chicago episodes, but also through fighting against sanctuary cities and immigration enforcement against the express wishes of local populations, it's a real problem. And it's a problem, again, federalism was meant to be one of the key protectors against authoritarianism. And we have an Insurrection Act with limitations as to when the president can send in troops against the wishes of a governor. And that's only happened 4 times in history, once during the Reconstruction and 3 times during the Civil Rights Movement. And now we have this potential end run around the Insurrection Act and the ability of the president to send paramilitary troops into our cities. Dangerous, undermines the ability of DHS in the future to work closely with state and local governments. And I think it undermines public support for the department altogether. So I think that's the biggest problem facing it. And I think in terms of solutions, we might need legal guardrails around the department, including amending the statute that enabled Acting Secretary Wolf to send people into the cities. We will need also stronger management. We have a lot of actings in place, but people who aren't Senate confirmed, and then finally the abdication of the Senate's role in advice and consent and oversight over this. So I think DHS has a lot to do, I think, to sort of really bring its credibility back with the public.
Yeah, that's helpful. If for those of you, taking themes here, this is a huge concern for this idea of Homeland Security, is its seeming detachment from its consumers, and it's the people who should be protected by it, but also have to be integrated into it. And on that point, Alan, I want to turn to you first. You talked about integration, right? And both in the homeland with the enterprise, and then also globally. I can't think of of an instance where we feel more disintegrated, more detached than how we are right now in terms of a response to COVID, both a global and a domestic response. And I wanted to ask you sort of, is this fixable if, with either a change in a presidency, or is this the nature of borderless threats?
So, Juliette, I think it's interesting. When we set out to create this book, we thought about looking back. We thought, where had Homeland Security been? How was DHS doing? How could We actually assessed the Homeland Security enterprise at that point, now 17 years after DHS was created, 19 years today since 9/11. What's interesting is that so much of the book is now relevant to the agenda going forward. Figure out how actually do we build on this. One of the chapters that, given your responsibilities at DHS for intergovernmental relations, and then mine with regard to international affairs, was to stress how the entire Homeland Security enterprise is dependent on partnerships. This is the way it would operate within a federal system, and we have to build these up. And as all of us know who've been involved in government service, stovepipes characterize bureaucracies. By the way in which our government is divided, it's very difficult to actually ensure coordination or data sharing or operational cooperation and the like. I could take, Seth and I should debate this. I actually don't think it's a matter of law. It's a matter of good sense and public leadership. We can't legislate against stupidity. And what we need to do is integrate, but do it in the old-fashioned way, which is respect, listening to agencies at every level of government, and also taking our foreign partners seriously again and engaging for the reasons I indicated.
Okay, great. Chap and Amy, do you have any follow-ons to that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the mistake that we're seeing play out in this particular administration is the suggestion that a response to COVID is really resting on the shoulders of the governors and the mayors at the local level. There's a very important role for the federal government to play here. And there's a very important role for the Department of Homeland Security to play here. In the first instance, in terms of setting nationwide standards and really kind of creating a culture around them, it's critically important. I think back when we dealt with Ebola, for example, the goal was to make sure all the information that we had about how to manage infections was shared with the state governments, with the governors, with the public health authorities, so that people weren't trying to make it up on their own as they went along. And that's just not happening here, and that's a critical role for the federal government to play. Likewise, when it comes to things like reporting where the cases are happening, if you're not tracking and tracing and sending out response teams as there's an outbreak, then you're just not managing the response effectively. We learned that the hard way through multiple experiences. It's in a playbook that when we were in the Obama administration, we left for this administration, not because we did it perfectly, but frankly, because we learned so many lessons along the way. And we wanted to make sure the next administration had the tools it needed. And that goes also with respect to things like PPE. We don't want states competing with one another over very important, critical resources. There needs to be a method, coordination, sharing of information, sharing of materials. And so we're just really seeing the impact of the lack of all of that in the current response to COVID.
I think
Yeah,
that's
on all of that.
let me turn to you. Sorry.
Yeah, no,
Go ahead.
thanks. I mean, I obviously agree with all of that. The only other thing I'd mention is that COVID shows us the problems when we don't have a good regime for understanding privacy, as Steve was discussing, and we don't have a lot of trust in government. And this has raised its head with respect to contact tracing. So unless we solve that issue, we will be less effective in the next pandemic.
I think that's right. And Seth, a little bit about, just sort of in terms of a national approach to this getting stuff. I mean, I always say this when I'm on air, which is, no offense to my doctor friends and the doctor analysis, they're not saying, we know exactly what to do. This is an execution problem now. I don't need to be told to wear a mask anymore. I'm there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that, again, the problem here is a failure of leadership, I think, from the top. And I think it's also a failure, again, back to my previous comments, I think certainly politicization. I think we saw that with the FEMA Supply Chain Task Force and essentially turning what was relatively a simple problem. It's a challenging problem in the sense of most PPE, N95 masks, made in China, other places around the world. had to get across, difficult borders now after COVID that had to get here. But for whatever reason, failure of leadership or politicization at the top, the supply chain task force at FEMA screwed it up. And what a normal problem turned into a Wild West global market of PPE with scams everywhere. I mean, unclear, where people were getting their PPE coming into the country, and continuing shortages not only for healthcare workers, but also for other essential workers, including teachers and meat processors and whatever else. And so you have this real crisis that really continues today. And then on top of it, you have, I think, probably irrational decisions on exports of PPE, and also inability to make decisions between FEMA and HHS with regard to increasing hospital and ICU capacity and all that. I think it's really just been a breakdown of leadership here.
Yeah, and I want to turn to Steve on that, sort of on the, just given your role at DHS. So over the course of the Trump administration, it's a huge challenge, I think, politically. You have the sort of, rallying cry, abolish cops, but people should remember that, maybe a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago with the child separation, it was abolish ICE. And then in light of what happened with Portland, a abolish DHS movement, which I think does put the other party, Democrats in this case, in sort of, tough footing. So maybe in some ways I want to ask you, like, is the department defensible? And if it were just to disappear and its various components do something, what would be lost? Like, what's the best case at this stage, given all the problems we've seen?
That's a big question. I
know.
I'm not necessarily an advocate for keeping the department exactly the way it is, but there's a problem of kind of moving the deck chairs around just to feel like you've created new boxes and have actually done something. I think one of the things that's going on, and we saw it in Portland and in other contexts, is there's a part of the department's mission, which you can call it fear management. Certainly in a counterterrorism context, one of the department's roles is not to magnify a violent incident into something that really scares the heck out of everybody. That's what terrorism is all about, is creating terror. So one of the core sort of missions of the department is to project a competence and a reassuring presence, and part of that is being candid about what's going on, and not using fear to rile people up in order to advance a political agenda. And so when we say we see the politicization of DHS, what we're really seeing is something that is undermining the ability of DHS to combat fear and reassure people. That's what feeling more secure about, is not feeling afraid. So we've turned it around. We've done that in the immigration context. We've done it in the kind of response to the protests, and so that's a lot of kind of institutional capital that's been dissipated, and how you rebuild that is a real challenge. I will say, when I hear people talk about abolishing DHS or abolishing ICE, that to me tells me that people do not respect the rules that those agencies are supposed to be enforcing. And certainly in the immigration context, although there are plenty of problems with ICE, one of the core problems with ICE is that they are enforcing a series of rules that, from both the left and the right, people don't agree are the right rules. So what we need to do is come up with the right rules and the right standards. We need immigration reform. And then we could have an ICE or a DHS that could enforce those rules. So we live by the rules that we agree are reasonable. Right now, we've got rules that don't work. And so the people who are tasked with trying to enforce those rules are, kind of on the front end of the public backlash. And so I'm not really answering your question so much as pointing out the fundamental issue here goes deeper than just DHS.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, look, the abolish ICE is because immigration enforcement is crappy. Like, it's not fun. You know, someone's got to do it. That mission will continue whichever presidency it is, but it's understanding, you know, how would you want to do it and how would you want to force it? I want to turn to Pete Neffenger, because you've worked at various components at the department and thinking, and you know each of their cultures. You grew up in one and ended in the other, their cultures. But, you know, there's this question of especially for progressives or Democrats, that, you know, the department was a beast of Bush, you know, in the 9/11 world, and then all sorts of horrible things happened. And then now being used in a way that feels very isolating to, or irrelevant to most Americans.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. So I'd like to build on a couple of things that Steve brought up. And I think Steve makes some good points about reorganizing without a clear vision as to what that is. You know, I spent, I think I went through 12 major reorganizations in the Coast Guard during my time in the Coast Guard. And, you know, some of those made sense and some of those just confused people. And that's from an agency that I consider one of the better agencies in the federal government. So I think reorganizing sounds like an easy answer, but it typically does exactly what Steve says. It just moves a bunch of boxes around and gives people new titles and maybe redraws and change the command, but the fundamental problems will still be there. To me, the challenge of the department is that, you know, it has a huge remit. If you look at the totality of the authorities and the requirements and the missions that have been put on the shoulders of the various components and agencies, that's never been well explained to the American public. It's not always fully understood by the individuals within the department, because there's a real confederation within the department and not a real consolidation of effort. It goes back to the point I was trying to make in my opening comments was, until you build to a common understanding of what the face is that you want to present, it's very hard for the department as a whole to present a face to the federal. So it doesn't surprise me that agencies default to what the law requires them to do, and sometimes default in the most egregious ways to what the law requires them to do, because it's a safe place to be. It's a safe place to say, I'm just enforcing the law. I think the cause to abolish or transform or do things, well, I understand where they come from. It doesn't answer the fundamental question. You still have issues with respect to managing borders, to protecting the country, to safeguarding, you know, our trade and all the things that the department does, and responding to natural disasters in the way in which we do it. So all that stuff still has to be attended to. And if you just say, I want to throw it all away, you're still left with this big question as to, all right, now what do we do? And who's gonna take care? Julia, it's kind of like back during the BP oil spill when there was a question that said, why don't you just fire BP? And you know, Admiral Thad Allen quite rightfully said, well, then what would I do? You know,
Yeah.
They're the ones with the money, the resources, and the ability to fix this.
Yeah. Alan, I want to know, you wanted to chime in on this, and then Seth.
Just quickly, I think the book actually, while we disagreed on many points in the debate that readers will find, we actually ended up agreeing that the Homeland Security, for all the imperfections, for all of DHS's problems, that it really was not unexpected that a 10-year bureaucracy, now a 17-year-old bureaucracy, would take a long time to unfold in a rational way. We're still seeing the Pentagon, arguably one of our more effective bureaucracies. Actually, it took almost 50 or 60 years before it started functioning. It required legislation like Goldwater-Nichols in the 1980s to actually realign it. You know, it may well be that we could use a Goldwater-Nichols to integrate DHS more effectively, but that's far more limited than saying we're going to abolish the department or abolish any of its components or move the Secret Service back to Treasury or over to DOJ. That gets into what Steve and Pete identified as moving the deck chairs. So I think what we need is recognition of the partnership function of DHS and its outreach to the private sector, to the world, and also to other state and local governments. If we eliminated DHS, we'd have to reinvent it soon enough. The fact of the matter is that after 9/11, and the purpose of the book was to say we've evolved past counterterrorism as the cornerstone. Not that counterterrorism isn't a concern, but it's no longer the cornerstone of the department. What we need to avoid now is not to recognize the need for public health without making pandemics the cornerstone of DHS for the next generation. But balance is not something we do well at DHS.
Seth, I'm going to turn to you.
Okay.
Seth, and then Chap, are you on this one? Yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah, I was just going to say back to a few points. First off, with regard to responding to Steve's comment on immigration enforcement, 100% agree with that in the sense of having been at CBP and also at DHS overseeing borders and immigration. I mean, there's no substitute for political consensus in terms of making law enforcement function better. And we absolutely need immigration reform, which will help with the process and gaining consensus on immigration enforcement. But on the issue of reorganizations, yeah, I mean, again, with Steve and also with Pete, there are plenty of areas where I could see rearranging deck chairs a little bit, but I go at the reorganization question from the perspective of having been at DHS, or what became DHS when DHS was created, and having been head of policy for what became CBP when we were detangling the budgets of CBP, ICE, and USCIS, and the fight over the simultaneous divorce of Customs and INS and the breakup of those agencies, and then simultaneously a marriage to create CBP and unify that agency. And I'll tell you, I mean, the organizational churn that was involved with that was truly epic, and the enormous fights between CBP and ICE that continue to this day over, no, those are our airplanes, no, those are our airplanes. It reminds me of the fights between my two children, my two boys. It's not something that I want to go through again unless it's absolutely necessary. And the last thing I'll end on is I remember early on when DHS was created, Tom Ridge brought in a great guest speaker to talk about the successes of mergers and how we can actually do this. And that guest speaker was Carly Fiorina, which was right before the HP Compact merger collapsed. Right. And she was talking about, this is how you can do a successful merger, and this is how we're going. Tom Ridge was very confidently showing Carly Fiorina, and little did we know, 6 months later, the whole house of cards at HP Compact collapsed. So, words for the wise.
Yeah. Chad, let me turn to you quickly, and then Amy, I want to ask you a question about new terror threats.
Yeah, I just want to echo what my colleagues have said about this misguided impulse to redraw lines on an organizational chart for the hope of obtaining greater aesthetics or kind of clarity, paper and pencil style. That's a terrible way to go. After 17 years, the bureaucratic lanes are much clearer now, and we don't want to reinvent them. I would also say this is the kind of discussion that we might want to have at a very nuanced operational level with regard to kind of specific elements. If DHS were in a better place right now, but this is an analogy that Seth and I have talked about. When the Obama administration left office, I would say DHS looked like Berlin in 1990. There were parts that were under construction. There were parts that were beautiful, and you could sort of see the gleaming city that it was going to become 30 years hence, right? Unfortunately, right now, DHS looks more like Berlin in 1948 as a kind of bombed out Hulk. And so we need to first get to 1990. And we also need to make sure that DHS doesn't become like Berlin in 1938, which is another terrifying possibility.
So Amy, I want to turn to you. Thank you all. Amy, I want to turn to you. We have some great questions actually lined up. I'm going to steal a couple more minutes over here. So you think about a certain threat, and there's a great child in the background. I love it. You think about a certain threat, and a dog. I love that even better. A certain threat that started 9/11. That started Americans' conception of Homeland Security, even though all of us had somewhat been in the space before that. It was called different things: civil defense, domestic preparedness, whatever it was. 9/11 happens. It focuses us on a certain terror threat, Al-Qaeda in that instance. And then the way I think about the department is there was a course correction call it what you will, in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina, that a department so focused on one threat had lost its capacity to save an American city from drowning, or had helped save an American city from drowning. Fast forward to today, and when you think about the threat, there's just no question, quoting the FBI and anyone who's in the space, about the white supremacy, neo-Nazi threat, domestic threat. But it raises different issues. It's not an immigration, a border, keep them out. It raises different issues from a Homeland Security perspective, the right to bear arms, the right to free speech, the right to assemble. And just wanted to know, you were in the Obama administration when Charleston happened, the killings in Charleston and others, when we started to see that uptick. It's now gone, three or four times of what it used to be. So I'd love your thoughts on sort of, what are those challenges? And then how would you address it moving forward, different type of terror threat?
So there's no question that right now the major threat to the United States in terms of numbers of incidents is coming from white nationalist extremist violence. And frankly, the department is not really built to respond to it. And this goes back to something I wrote about actually for the book, which is that there was kind of a failure to capture all of the pieces that should have been in a department focused on Homeland Security, and specifically thinking about the law enforcement functions that we see within the FBI, right? And so instead of having agencies that are working very closely together, you end up in a situation where you often have agencies that are competing with one another, not always effectively sharing information the way they need to, suspicious of one another's motives, and suspicious of how each other will use vital information that's critical. So the department really, I think of it as capabilities that need to be addressed, right? The capability to defend our coastline, the capability to defend aviation, the capability to identify threats coming in on our airplanes or across our border. But the one capability that is missing is the capability that allows for the effective addressing of threats that are developing inside the country. And I think that's part of why the department has not handled it very well in the past. I mean, we'll all remember what happened when Janet Napolitano tried to take on the issue of white nationalist violence.
Yeah, and I wonder, Steve, I mean, you dealt with it, the legal regime is very different. The rights of the potential perpetrators are very different if you're talking about a foreign terrorist versus domestic. And are there ways for it to be solved within the department or through a different legal regime?
Well, we don't really have a legal regime that designates things as domestic terrorism. So it's kind of a made-up concept from a legal perspective. And it is that, at the first instance, it's a local law enforcement challenge.
Yeah.
I think there is room for DHS to, through the fusion centers and other information sharing methods, to share useful intelligence and help law enforcement in local jurisdictions be prepared for things, and be strategic about the deployment of resources. But the line between what's political and what's sort of a domestic terror agenda, unfortunately, is getting more blurred lately. And so that really does create some challenges that go beyond the things that DHS typically does. So I'm not sure DHS is well positioned to actually do very much directly with respect to the domestic violent organizations. It's just, we're not really set up legally for that to happen. Federal government doesn't have general federal police power.
Seth.
Yeah, I mean, just actually chiming in exactly that point is that the federal government does not have general police power. And so while certainly, I think in terms of the terrorist threat, I think I would agree, and I think DHS would agree, although it seems now reluctant to agree with itself, on the threat presented by white nationalist extremists. And certainly more people have died from white nationalist extremists since 9/11 than Islamist terrorists. It's just barely, but it's more. And I think, obviously the obvious problems here on DHS's role is no general policing power. Also, there's the role of the FBI. I mean, the FBI also has a significant role in countering terrorism and countering violence and federal crimes. So there is the turf fight between the FBI and DHS as to who's got the lead here in different areas. And then obviously state and local governments. I mean, Steve's right. I mean, Dylan Roof in Charleston, he wasn't charged with domestic terrorism. The El Paso shooter, not charged with domestic terrorism. They're charged with either federal hate crimes charges or they're charged with state and local murder charges. Right. So it's a challenging thing legally to think about with white nationalism. And the other thing also, I guess I would say with regard to the white nationalist threat, it's a serious threat that we need to take seriously. However, I think certainly there are other threats, I think that, perhaps are more cataclysmic, I think, for DHS to be thinking about as well, including, conceivably the threat from China and Russia with regard to critical infrastructure, with regard to communications, with regard to critical technologies and the role that DHS plays in all of those areas. Also in the issues of social media and not only for radicalization for terrorism, as we saw with Kenosha and with white nationalists, but also more broadly with regard to disinformation from the Russians and whatever else. And I think DHS has a role in that. Again, it's a very careful role consistent with the First Amendment. And then I think I'm sitting in California right now, and our state is on fire. And I think the other huge issue that huge threat that I think DHS is going to have to face in the next 10 years, perhaps maybe the biggest one, is the implications of climate change and natural disasters.
Yeah, let me end this part of the panel with Pete, because if you think we've done terrorism, public health, or the borderless threats, I know there's lots of questions about election security and cybersecurity, but climate change. I mean, if you think, there's pressing threats and then there's existential ones, right? I mean, the West is on fire. It is 10% of an entire state has been evacuated. Pete, you spent a lot of time in disaster management, obviously the BP oil spill, but other efforts by the Coast Guard, Hurricane Katrina. Each individual one can be excused as a fluke, and then you start to see a theme. So is the department, or even the way we think about it, the correct way to think about what I would view as, the thing my kids are going to be dealing with pandemics and white supremacy. They are going to be, I think, unfortunately, existentially, their lives will be different because of climate change.
Well, Juliette, so I'll build my answer off of the comments that Seth just made with respect to, being ready and thinking about the way in which you present yourself. Part of the challenge for Homeland Security, and it's something that DHS just doesn't do well, is communicate with the public about the risks and the challenges that we face, particularly those that are existential. So there's a communication piece that's largely been missing over the years, and that then it just becomes this face that shows up periodically with differing levels of acceptability on the part of the public. That's particularly important when it comes to things going wrong. If you think that the department is largely designed to prevent bad things from happening, well, it doesn't always happen. And sometimes the bad things happen irrespective of anything a department could do because it's a natural disaster or you've got some other issues going on. So you always have to be prepared to respond. And I don't think that we have communicated that very well to the people who have to do it, nor do we prepare very well for the very things that we have to respond to. And instead look to place blame for why something happened instead of looking to understand the structural and underlying reasons for things, climate change, increasing urbanization of areas that were never urbanized before, or pushing out into wild areas that are more prone to fires and so forth. And not looking to place any blame on people, but these are just management issues that have to be addressed. And then we have to have some means of supporting the kinds of response that has to happen. You can't just pretend that this is a fluke. We know that this is the 4th or 5th fire season in a row that's become increasingly worse for California. I spend a lot of time in California. I can tell you it's a pretty frightening place to be for a lot of my friends and colleagues now. So I think that the response mission of the department can't just be an afterthought, and it can't just be a FEMA problem. and it can't just be a Coast Guard problem if there's a hurricane. It really is, it's one of the fundamental reasons the department was created. If you think about it, it was the response to a terrorist attack. And then over the years, we've evolved the department to be much more involved in the full range of things that can affect us domestically. And I think you have to give voice to that. You have to communicate that. You have to help people understand what the risks are that they face. What's my play in this as an individual? You know, what are you doing for me? How are you communicating those risks to me on my behalf? Whether it's risk from, you know, domestic terrorism or risk from domestic disaster.
Yeah. Listen, I want to thank everyone. I don't want to ignore this great audience of a couple hundred people, but I want to thank the panelists first. We'll go around at the end, but there are some great questions and some hard ones. I want to begin with one that I think is very fair and that we have to address, which is essentially, and Alan, I think this would go to you first, which is the extent to which financing supports potentially some of the protest movements, either on the left or the right. I'm going to read this, and I can't pronounce the name, so I apologize. I'll just read it from one of the audiences. You know, could this be the cartels, mafia, and others supporting it in terms of some of the paramilitary activity that we're seeing on, and I'll add this, on both of the right and the left, I think it's safe to say, but it's a big issue that I think needs to be addressed.
Yeah. So this is the problem of everything being transnational, and we're in a situation where social media will spread a point of view such that it's no longer debatable, but rather accepted. It's part and parcel of the polarization that we have. But the interesting problem that we have is that there is no reliable way to actually get an investigation of that allegation that would be believable or credible across the spectrum of political opinion. That's one of the larger wounds currently in our body politic that needs to be repaired. So, you know, I think the idea that the Russians are interfering in the election and in this campaign, I think it's generally accepted by the intelligence community. I've seen no reports that I deem credible that suggest that that Black Lives Matter is being funded by the mafia or by the GRU, or that right-wing supremacist groups are being funded by outside sources. What we have to do is rebuild the institutional credibility of our government so that we don't have endless debates on social media, let alone between our chief executive officer and any particular citizen. So it's a fair question, to be sure. And one of the things that I think we've been suggesting needs to be rebuilt is a capacity to answer questions like that, to do it efficiently, and to do it in a way that's credible and beyond reproach. We have a lot of work to get there.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to add into that? Because I know that there's a question on the private sector that Amy, I would love Amy to answer, just sort of its integration, but also budgetary issues and other issues.
Can I just take a quick swing at that? Because I have a slightly heretical view on this issue of countering violent extremism.
Okay, great.
I think it was one thing when the violent extremism that was being countered was based abroad, and it was akin to helping the enemy in the context of a war. I think it's another thing when we're looking at domestic political movements and then trying to approach them through the lens of terrorism, when we could be approaching them through the lens of ordinary law enforcement authorities. And in this sense, I think it's a slippery slope and a dangerous one in a direction we don't want to go. I mean, there are questions coming through in the Q&A about incel, about QAnon, about Antifa. And I think if we go down this road, we will regret it. So I would move away from that and move much more in the direction of using ordinary law enforcement authorities in the normal way.
Hey, Juliette, can I just jump in quickly?
Oh yeah, sorry, Steve, yeah.
You know, there is a component of DHS that doesn't get a lot of attention, which could actually play a very constructive role in the domestic issues that we're seeing right now, and that's FLETC. So that's the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. And it trains not only federal law enforcement officers, but typically 30 or 40,000 state and local police go through their training programs on use of force and, kind of best practices for policing. That is a tool that perhaps a different administration would have pushed to the fore as part of the response to what's going on, as a way to not defund the police, but make the police better serve the communities that they're there to serve. And so, that's a lost opportunity as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, Amy, I wanted to follow up on a question that I think got lost, but I think it actually relates to, and this is a role that the White House would have done, which is basically it sounds boring, but budgets are about values, and also the extent to which the private sector and other parts of the enterprise may be able to pick up some of the burdens that the department has. Is that even realistic?
So there are two separate questions in there, and I'm happy to take a swing at both.
Yeah.
The question of budgets matter. So, in some ways they're symbolic, but they really frame the vision and the policy direction that a president intends to take. So when it comes to something like immigration, in a Biden administration, everybody's going to be looking at what are his detention budget numbers. Does he really intend to fulfill the vision of immigration that he's laid out? When it comes to dealing with the most significant threats to the United States, people are going to be looking at, well, where's the money going? And in this administration, we're seeing a lot of money going to building a wall, right? So it's it does signal what the president really cares about and where the administration should be functioning or focused. But there's a secondary question, which is, what is the role of the private sector? And I thought, and Juliette, I'm sure you had lots of experience with this, so much of what DHS does relies on relationships that are within the private sector. So, for example, look at the threat of cyber attacks. DHS doesn't control every entity that is going to be subject to a cyber attack. You look at the airlines, you look at many of our critical infrastructure entities. You have to have a relationship of trust and information sharing for the homeland to really be safe when it comes to some of the most specific threats that where we could be quite vulnerable. And so that's tricky, figuring out how to get the right relationship with the private sector so that we can share information without necessarily disclosing confidential information. It's something that I know the department struggled with and may not have it right yet, but it's a place where we need to be looking in the future.
Yeah. I want to pick up on a question that, and I apologize, I seem to have lost it, but maybe Pete, I'll start with you. There's been a lot about the military in the homeland, whether it's the Insurrection Act, but there's an entire structure and legal regime around the use of the military. Coast Guard sort of falls slightly in between the two. But Northcom, National Guard, there's the question, I think the question, I'm not sure we can let the person in, but just sort of, what is the legacy of that? And how do we put the military genie back in the bottle if we need to?
Well, you're right. There is a process for using the military, and it has to be pretty extreme. The good news is you don't need to use the Department of Defense anywhere for domestic law enforcement. There's so many entities that are already available. It goes back to Chap's point, I thought was well made, that first and foremost, we are dealing with a lot of law enforcement related issues, and that starts at the local level. Governors, if you want to get people in a military uniform, governors have at their disposal the National Guard, and they can activate them under a state authority and use them for law enforcement assistance, if you will, if not direct law enforcement, for those entities of the National Guard that are trained in police force or police actions. But I think it's a mistake to think about turning to the military. That would be an extreme last and I hope a never type of resort. You don't need that. We've got hundreds and hundreds of local law enforcement agencies. You've got a lot of law enforcement capability, even within the federal government, the FBI, within the Department of Homeland Security. The Coast Guard, as you mentioned, is at all times a a federal law enforcement entity, primarily for maritime matters. And you've got any number of different entities. So I don't know why we would immediately turn to an organization like the Department of Defense for domestic purposes. You saw the organ rejection from the Department of Defense for that.
Yeah.
From the Joint Chiefs all the way through the political leadership. They just said this is not an appropriate use, and I think that's true. We don't want a politicized military, and we don't want our military used against our own people.
Yeah, I mean, I'll chime in here. I'm getting out of my moderator role, but I was a state Homeland Security advisor, which meant I worked for governor. So I oversaw the National Guard, and I've never served in the military, but obviously spent most of my career with the military in that role where there are sort of very, very defined roles. And what people don't understand, you even get well-meaning people during a disaster saying, let's bring in the military. The military is integrated with emergency management functions quite easily. They're working with state emergency management agencies all the time. So like whenever I hear like the administration say, well, vaccine distribution will be done by the military, I'm like, oh, please. I mean, military does bulk really easily. The intimacy of a vaccine campaign, for example, is not going to be done by the military. They'll move it, right? But then you got to work with your public health and local and state officials. So one of the things that was amazing to me from that perspective, which I saw repeated when I was at the department, we created the Council of Governors with the Department of Defense. That was 10 governors, 5 Republican, 5 Democrat, that I served on, that was really trying to define these roles because the culture of the military was, we don't want to be used this way. And the culture of the National Guard was essentially, if not deployed to Iraq, we're owned by the governor, where this bifurcated thing that you've seen recently is not part of their tradition. So if you ask me as a Obama administration official, what moment was I incredibly nervous about the transition of power, potential not peaceful transition of power? It was Lafayette. I went to bed that night thinking something's terribly wrong here. And I spent enough time on Twitter to believe lots is wrong, but I then began to think could it be that I am, my children will live in a very different country. So what you saw, the pushback by the Pentagon was really, really important. To say these roles are well defined. So for those who worry about that, there was a moment that then got, I think, corrected, which is part of the culture of both the distinction between Homeland and Homeland resources with the governor and more traditional.
And Juliette, there is an appropriate role for the Department of Defense and the military agencies, and that's support to civil authorities in times of emergencies.
Exactly.
And nobody does logistics better than the DoD. Yeah. And they provide that kind of support. They want to provide that support because they have that capability, and whether that's generators or food or just distribution of supplies, but they're very happy to do that. Yeah. And appropriately reluctant, and if not directly opposed to any other types of direct engagement.
Right. Seth, I want to turn to you. We have a whole bunch of questions really on the white supremacy issue, and Rachel raises and sort of adds an adjective, which I think is important, the male supremacist terrorism. And in other words, that a lot of this is also a type, I guess a gender type, but of white supremacy. In terms of your thoughts about what is both a domestic threat, but also transnational, the rise of right-wing extremism, and a very distressing story in the New York Times or Politico about the rise of neo-Nazism abroad, looking to our neo-Nazi movement as something to model.
Yeah, well, I mean, on that one, that's a long story of American history in the sense of, I mean, our eugenics, pseudoscience in the late 19th century, early 20th century, race science was very influential on Hitler and the Nazis. So, I mean, there's certainly a dialogue on white supremacy between the United States and the rest of the world. It's been going on for about 150 years. So yeah, I mean, it's not surprising of that. And it's also, I mean, I highly recommend, there's a great book by Anne Applebaum that she just wrote about Twilight of Democracy. It talks, I mean, really it's about the split of the right wing, a split of the center right into sort of the blood and soil nationalists that we're seeing in the United States and in Europe, as well as, and then the sort of the old center right. And I think in that, I mean, yeah, you're seeing this is a transnational issue. I mean, the attack in Christchurch, New Zealand, by a white supremacist attacking a mosque in New Zealand. But the interesting thing, the alignment of what we're seeing is one theory, which is this conspiracy theory that I think is in the white nationalist ideology of the Great Replacement theory. And you heard that in Charlottesville, of the people chanting as they were the Unite the Right rally. They're marking down the street saying, "You will not replace us." And they're also were saying Jews will not replace us as well. So there's that dark side as well that's all out there. And I think it's this sort of fear of the other people have called white genocide of whether immigration and whether demographic change and other things like that are essentially replacing whites at the top of the pyramid in Europe and the United States and in Canada and in New Zealand, Australia. So it's a real problem. It's a real ideology. It's a transnational threat. I think, you know, there's some who raise the question of whether left-wing extremism is as much of a problem as right-wing extremism. That's not really borne out by the facts or the data, at least not right now. I mean, if you'd said, you know, in the 1960s and 70s with the era of the Weathermen and all that, yeah, maybe we could talk about it then. But right now, I think the real threat is from the right wing, and I think DHS would agree with that. I also think, you know, in the sense there is this tactic that's been used, I think called accelerationism, sort of the lingo of it, in the sense of the tactic of the white wing extremists sort of going into areas and trying to provoke violent responses and then tit for tat responses to therefore spark race war and also spark chaos, which would induce the federal government to come in with authoritarian measures, which unfortunately has also been apparently the strategy, the political strategy, I think, of this White House. I mean, as evidenced by Kellyanne Conway talking about a few weeks ago, saying, you know, chaos works for us.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, there's some danger there in terms of the interaction between the two. And I guess the last thing I'll say is just the role of the federal government here, in the sense of back to the concept of the military. I mean, we do need to sort of think about, I mean, this is a federalism issue at the end of the day. And since the Civil War, the military has only been used in states without the consent of the governor, or 4 times. I mean, once by Grant against the Ku Klux Klan in South Carolina, and 3 times during the Civil Rights Movement, Eisenhower in Little Rock and JFK in Mississippi and Alabama. It doesn't happen very often, and for good reason. And you, as Juliette, as a former state Homeland Security director, I mean, it's a very sensitive issue here in the sense that all of the use of federal resources, for the most part, should be used unless there's extreme need with the consent and usually at the request of the state or the local government, saying, we need help, we need support, we need logistics support, we need help. Like I lived through Los Angeles riots in 1992, and we asked for help. We had Marines from Camp Pendleton come up to help deal with the riots out here and also federalize the California, the National Guard out here. But that's the way it should work. It's the way it works under the Stafford Act. It's the way it works under the Insurrection Act for the most part. And it's the way it should work with DHS generally, is that this should be done even in combating the white nationalist extremist threat. For the most part, these are these are state and local crimes if they're getting into violence, and the state and local law enforcement authorities should take the lead here unless absolutely necessary.
Yeah. Okay, I want to go back just quickly. We have a couple more minutes. I appreciate that, Seth. I want to, because we get a lot of questions about the private sector. I think part of that may be, I mean, in my mind, is if you thought, okay, we have the absence of a federal government in some ways on the COVID response, you're seeing the private sector, you know, they were at masking first. Think of Uber, no mask, no ride. You know, think of the closing down of retail. So I'd love to just maybe pick up on that theme with Alan and Steve, and then we'll close out with Chap and I.
Yeah, so the private sector is absolutely essential, as it is in all dimensions of American life, society, and economics. And particularly in a democratic society, it's not, we're not in a situation where the government is required to do everything, think everything, and account for everything. So while, I don't think the Homeland Security enterprise has got yet a military-industrial complex question, which is, is made in part contributed so mightily to the Pentagon. the fact of the matter is many functions in DHS are actually either contracted out to the private sector or delegated to the private sector. And this is a strength that we need to capitalize upon. There needs to be a proper relationship and an ethical one to be sure. But the private sector is essential to the Homeland Security enterprise. Not only, Juliette, the way you suggested with policies, but particularly in the cybersecurity area. This is a matter of government facilitating the private sector to actually care for itself. And this is a trend that we need to continue. One of the questions that we ask at the end of the book is, how much can we actually rely on the government? Have we gotten to the point where de Tocqueville's America really is irretrievable? And I think the answer that we are all comfortable with, or most of us, is that we need to go back and rely on citizenry as well as the private sector more and more in dealing with the threats to the homeland.
Steve,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I don't have much to disagree there. I think Alan made some excellent points. There's a convening authority that the federal government and DHS has. It's a tool, and DHS is full of public servants. They're there to serve the public. They should be connected to the public, being the private sector here. So communication, dialogue, collaboration. Those are the things that DHS ought to be doing better, because it's not primarily, in the eyes of the public, a law enforcement agency. It's there as a security agency. It's there to help people be prepared and to recover. And those ought to be things that if the agency had a better reputation, basically, if it were more trusted, it would be more effective at. And it's particularly true in the cyberspace. But it's true across the board.
Yeah. Steve, I want to thank you for those final comments. Of course, Chap, Alan, Seth, Pete, and Amy. It is 90 minutes is a lot to ask of you all, and it's a lot to ask of the audience. I want to thank you all for sticking with us. It's amazing. So there's one final question, which I think is a good way to end. Again, I want to thank from my team over at the Belfer Center, Yvonne and Tara. I think Tara's still on, for all of their tremendous work. If any of the editors over at Belfer are also on, I want to thank them. Edited volumes have the mythology of being easier than written volumes, but ask Chap and Alan, who really, and Chap in particular, they are not easier. But I want to get to that question about how the role of academic institutions in Homeland Security. It is a huge challenge. I have been in this space, I was in counterterrorism, but by 2005, really sort of Homeland Security, and then worked for state government and then federal government. In the national security arena, and Amy probably felt this even in the White House in terms of pecking orders in some ways, it really is hard to get the fancy people at the State Department and these old institutions to really think about what Homeland Security is, because like Pete said, most people's interaction with it is a TSA agent. So there's so much room for intellectual vigor. And finally, after many years, I got the Kennedy School to really think about Homeland Security with our Homeland Security project as a core part, who can deny it now with COVID, a core piece of our national security, not just in terms of Homeland Defense, but our projection of strength to the outside world. If you don't think our response has China dancing and our allies worried, think again. These are huge national security implications for our Homeland response. So there is so much room for more academic vigor. I think we started here with the book. Well, this is weird. Okay, there. And encourage it with so many students and fellows and others on. So I want to thank the team over at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard, and my co-editors, Alan and Chap. And Chap, I'll end with you.
Thank you. First of all, can people hear the sound of my children hitting each other with wiffle ball bats in the background and the dog bar? I hope not, and I apologize if you can. I'd like to thank the Security Studies Program and the Center for International Studies who sponsored this event, and also Laura Kerwin and Michelle English. You never saw them, but they made the magic of all the technology work, including the chat and the Q&A functions. And of course, our speakers and most of all, the audience. Thanks to all of you. As I think you heard, this is a crucial time for the Homeland Security enterprise. So even though we're concluding this event, I hope very much you will keep the conversation going with colleagues, with classmates, with friends, and with family, especially on this day. So good afternoon and stay safe.